All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Rise Above Justice Movement, the podcast. My name is Zachary Mallory, and I am the host and the founder of the Rise Above Justice Movement and the Rise Above Justice Movement, the podcast. All right. So it's been a little bit. Um, we've been doing episodes periodically, and we have a new weekly show that me and my co-founder Gwen are doing, where we talk about the headlines and talk about a number of different things that's kind of going on in the political sphere, but also the policy sphere and the survivor space, and we kind of like do this whole mix. But I thought it was a good idea because we have a country to save. We have democracy. Now, have we ever truly seen a democracy state? No, because democracy is an actual functioning part of a society. However, other countries are further developed than the United States is. We understand that. We know that. We have a lot of work to do. We've come a long far, we've come a very long way, but we still have a lot further to continue going until we're all free, because none of us are free until we're all free. And I want to start by saying this: the person that I'm interviewing today to kickstart our candidate series. This will be the first interview of dozens as a part of the series. But Sparky, I'm so excited to sit down and talk with you about your platform and what's led you to running for office, because you're running for Congress in California. And there's a lot happening in the California space, and we'll dive into that in just a little bit. I sat down and interviewed a California State Senator, Sasha Perez, and got a little bit of an insight about what's happening in California and like the relief from the wildfires that took place last year. Obviously still leaves that lasting impact on the community, but again, welcome to the podcast. You're the very first candidate to be a part of this new series, and the series is highlighting candidates running at all different levels of government across the entire country, whether it be from federal office to your local water board, because every single election matters. And getting those progressive voices, a lot of change does happen locally, but we also need to make sure that we focus on every other election too, not just federal, not just local. You're also state, your school board. Make sure Moms for Liberty continues losing, the elections on the school boards. But again, welcome to the podcast. Feel free to introduce yourself, and let's just dive right in.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for having me, Zachary. Um, yeah, there is so much going on, not just in California, but around the nation. And I am super grateful for you and really platforming different voices, progressive voices around the country. I think it's super, super important to hear where everyone is at. And like there's different battles across the country depending on what your district looks like, what the people are demanding from their representatives across the country. So I'm very grateful for you. A little bit about myself. Yes, my name is Sparky Mitra, and I'm running for Congress in California's 50th district. The 50th district is in the greater San Diego region. My race is one of five that is in the greater San Diego region, and we represent people all the way from La Jolla to East Village and Coronado Island going south, and then all the way east to the unincorporated areas of Valley Center, Pomona, or sorry, Ramona and Poway. And so it's a very large district that I'm very, very excited to represent. For me personally, I actually started out very much in the engineering and science space. Yeah, yeah. So I started out as a bioengineer and I really do love the work that I did there. I was mainly engineering proteins and genes for applications in sustainability and more recently in more health related applications. But what I quickly realized, especially as I was getting a little bit older, as I was pursuing undergrad and then went to grad school, was that even though I love the work I'm doing in the lab, it's really hard to focus on what can be beneficial 20, 30 years down the line when people are struggling now and people are dying today. And that's kind of what really got me engaged in the community. It started out in high school as a gun violence prevention advocate, where I actually grew up in Texas. So I was very much a gun violence prevention advocate. And then pre-Dobbs decision, I was also advocating for reproductive rights. And I kind of brought that fight with me to California as well. And that is kind of how I got involved in advocacy at large. I was also involved in Bernie Sanders' second presidential campaign um before starting undergrad. And then during undergrad, I really kind of dug my heels into the housing justice advocacy space in California. Affordability is a huge issue in California, and in terms of rallying the youth in the San Diego region, housing was a very big pain point and remains one where I was really able to organize youth and get them to turn out to advocate for progressive change that would make attaining housing a little bit easier.
Yeah, and I love the housing justice space because we need to expand public option housing because
Mhm.
obviously housing vouchers go, a long way. However, it needs to be expanded upon because a lot of people have rejected those housing vouchers due to numerous reasons. And a lot of that is because of lack of funding that comes with that, especially from federal, because, then it leaks down to the state and then local. And what I've also seen a lot of the times, let me know what's happening in your community, but I live in the state of Kansas. I grew up in the state of Missouri, and obviously has its own issues, right? Kansas, became the first state to ban trans people from having a driver's license that matches their identity. So that was something that did pass, despite having a Democratic governor. She vetoed that bill, but with a supermajority, it was overturned.
Uh-huh.
And it didn't only attack driver's licenses, but it also attacked birth certificates. My partner is a transgender woman. Luckily, she had her stuff changed in the state of Missouri, even though she's from Kansas. Her driver's license is Missouri. However, her birth certificate obviously was amended, but it still is a part of Kansas because they accepted it. So there's a very real possibility that her birth certificate will most likely be reverted back should she ever need to use it, for like a job or like anything like that. It's a whole mess. But what we're seeing locally in the Kansas City metro area, you have a lot of these big corporations, right? So Airbnb is a big one, right? They will go into communities, they'll buy these homes, and they'll turn them into profit for them. So it's very predatory. It continues that because, they yank up the prices on it, like the short-term rentals, which takes away those homes for the long-term stability of the community. So let me know what's happening, in your community, what you're seeing with like housing wise, because they're also trying to criminalize people for being unhoused. I don't use the term homeless because it has a very like it has that negative context behind it. So like the unhoused community is the most vulnerable. And a lot of them are veterans. A lot of them are trans kids. A lot of them are survivors of trafficking that are fleeing their abusers. We're oftentimes asked, I'm a survivor myself. We're oftentimes asked, well, why didn't you just leave? Because it's literally not that simple, right? But what are you seeing in regards to like housing in your community and your opponent, Scott Peters, is Scott Peters? We'll dive into that in just a second. I have a couple questions I want to ask you specifically about what he's introduced during his time in Congress, which he's been in Congress since 2012 or
Mhm.
2012, 2013, around that time. And there are some good things that he has done. I will not lie. I will be the first to say that. However, a lot of his contributions are from PACs and those the big donors, right? Instead of the individual contributions, $200 or less. We'll dive into that here in just a little bit. But what are you seeing in regards to like housing in your community, and what are you hearing? I'm sure you've been canvassing. What are you kind of seeing? What are you hearing?
Yeah, for sure. So when you mentioned Airbnb, the
Mhm.
first thing that came to my mind was a pretty recent vote that happened in San Diego on the city level. So not so much federal policy, but on the city level, there was an initiative by housing justice organizers and people providing wraparound services to advocate for the city to put on the ballot a measure to tax empty homes and vacation rentals. It got amended, and what ended up passing was a tax on empty homes, which was great. It was what we were advocating, part of what we were advocating for initially. But when it came to vacation rentals, Airbnb turned out, and Airbnb paid many, many landlords from not even from really the San Diego region. They were from like Orange County, they were from north of San Diego to come out and speak on their behalf. And they brought busloads of these folks to
Mhm.
advocate on Airbnb's behalf, nobody
Mhm.
else's, not the people's. And yeah, that measure failed because of that. That version of the measure did not get on the ballot. What did end up getting on the ballot was an amended one where we would still tax any empty home, but not necessarily uh property that's used for vacation rentals. So so that severely constricted how many houses would be put back on the market through such a measure. And that was like a really big undertaking by so many community organizations that just did not pass because there was a flooding from very much a corporate interest. So that was like a very recent piece of legislation in our city in general. When it comes to, for example, statements that our mayor has issued, a lot of Trump's memorandums that kind of that diminish mental health issues among the unhoused community are directly lifted from memorandums that have been written by our Democratic mayor. So there is this continued blindness between both amongst both not just Republicans, but even among corporate Democrats to constantly criminalize, constantly diminish the needs of the unhoused population everywhere. And San Diego is definitely not immune from that. So many of our representatives here continue to do that. And I wouldn't necessarily put my opponent in that bucket. He's been better about housing. But in general, for me, in terms of federal policy, I very much agree with you that the public option is the way to go. And I would support really progressive legislation like the Homes Act, which was initially proposed by Representative AOC and
Mhm.
Senator Tina Smith, I believe.
Mhm.
And the reason I would support legislation like that is I really believe that there should be more federal funding for housing. We often think of housing as a local issue when there is so much money that can be dedicated. Under the Homes Act, that we would be able to dedicate $300 billion to to the issue of housing, and it would create a federal entity that would be responsible for giving out funds for community land trusts, for more public housing in general, to even to advocate for tenants' rights and not just serve homeowners, but people who are wanting to become homeowners and people who want to serve renters as well, and even bolstering tenants unions and so many other kind of ways that community members and community leaders try to really help address the housing crisis. So that is kind of what my legislation would look like. It wouldn't just be about building. I think building is super important, but I do think we need a corporate landlord ban, which is actually a bipartisanly supported issue, to a large extent. And I would really advocate for passing legislation like the Homes Act, which would bring more federal dollars into addressing the housing crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of federal dollars, um, a lot of grants have been cut, to help people gain housing. The first time home buyer, program, you have to meet a certain criteria, right? You have to have a certain credit score. You have to have a certain, this, certain that in order to even qualify for that loan. I know that from personal experience because I have a whole like story about like in that aspect, but that'll be shared like later on. But I just, thank you for saying that. And I want to kind of jump in a little bit because your opponent, Scott Peters, has taken $825,171 from APAC.
Mhm.
So obviously a big topic right now is, obviously Israel and the United States, and then obviously you have Iran or Iran. I always mess up on the saying. Um, but that's obviously a big topic right now. So, but $825,000 from APAC, that's not even registered as a foreign entity. That's not even registered. Oh God, but has such a huge influence. Now, obviously, 825,000 is not as much as somebody like Representative Jimmy Gomez. That's in the millions, right?
Mhm.
Specifically throwing that kind of in there, and then there's a couple others that obviously are on this list as well. But Scott Peters, 825,000. So thinking about APAC, but also, the influence of money in politics, what would you support as far as getting, the big money out of politics, specifically like APAC? Because there's also J Street. And then we also saw in the Illinois primary and, like others across the country, that APAC is also creating these other like shadow packs essentially, for lack of a better term. But they're framing it as like this whole like progressive movement, like Women for Chicago or whatever it was called. You have this like, oh hell yeah, this is a group of women. No, really, it is. However, it's still a part of those big dollars, right? And the influence of American politics whenever it comes to money, because obviously you have to have money in order to run for office. There's ways to kind of, because running for office, and this, is expensive as hell. It really is. But what would you support as far as like getting the big money out of politics? Do you support ending Citizens United? Obviously that's a really big topic as well. But thinking about like that trickle down economic, what's your thoughts on like money in politics?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I am a very strong advocate of publicly financed campaigns and that being the only way we should be financing our campaigns. I don't think big money should be in politics. I would be a strong advocate of even a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United permanently so that there's no constitutional agreement to fall back argument to fall back on, although I don't really think there ever was, regardless. Um,
No.
with the current Supreme Court, I do think that would be the easiest way to kind of be like, oh, this is constitutional. So I
Mhm.
would be very, very in favor of um overturning Citizens United and publicly financing campaigns. In terms of so legislatively, I think that's where that's what I would do first. In terms of the Democratic Party, though, it is really frustrating when within the party you have leaders who are constantly not listening to the people that make up the party. Because even the DNC had a very recent vote where there a vote came up to really kind of crack down on foreign and corporate funding, and that vote did not pass the DNC leadership. So there has been efforts by the general members of the DNC to kind of move this kind of progressive way of thinking about campaign financing forward, and not everyone is supporting that yet. In terms of my particular, and I think we can be better. In terms of my particular race, there are definitely investors, including APAC. There are definitely corporate PACs that have dictated what our current representation supports. And for
Mhm.
me, this kind of falls into two or maybe three major categories. First is, yes, the foreign interests in terms of APAC funding. APAC endorsed our current representation in 2022, did not endorse him in 2024, although he still accepted money from them, and then re-endorsed him in this cycle. So they would endorse him whenever he has a progressive challenger.
Of course. Of course.
Yes, 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 yes. So that's that getting that out is very, very important. And I'm someone who has advocated against the genocide in Palestine, both even actually before October 7th and definitely after I was a campus organizer in our encampments during grad school. So that is something I'm very, very passionate about. So that is definitely the first kind of source of um, special interest funding that
Mhm.
affects my race directly. The second source is big pharma. So in my race, our current representation has always been against expanding different kind of healthcare options. He does support like the Affordable Care Act now, but in terms of going further and towards a single payer system, for example, that's not something that he's been on board with. In fact, even under Biden, during Biden's Build Back Better Act, the initial version of drug pricing negotiations that the Build Back Better Act advocated for was very far reaching. It was very good in terms of negotiating the prices of so many drugs down. And what ended up getting passed was in large part due to what the current representation in my district advocated for, because
Mhm.
he believed that that broad range would not be helping these big pharma companies' bottom line. And so he advocated for a much smaller subsect of drugs being able to be negotiated on the federal level. So that is another big special interest group that has been severely affecting this race, particularly. And this is a very strong biotech hub. It is a very strong biotech hub. So many people are employed by that industry in my district. At the same time, as a biotech professional myself, I know that the best innovation comes when we're centering people. A lot of times, innovation that can be brought to market is not brought to market because it will not help insurance companies' bottom line. It won't help big pharma's bottom line. They would rather often keep people sick. And so for me, I believe that we can both bolster our biotech economy here and actually bring more dollars in, which Trump has done a horrendous job stripping so many science dollars away from communities. But we can bring that funding back, we can bring that money in while still centering people over profit. So these are definitely some of the biggest issues that have really been um, dictating how the current representative votes and really voting against our community, in my opinion. The
And
yes.
not, oh, sorry, go ahead. Say what you were about to say, because it's an important part. It's going to lead right into this. I already know exactly what you're about to say. Go ahead.
No, it was actually like transitioning a little bit into a third topic, so we could definitely touch on this first and then go to that as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I just wanted to, point out like one thing. And I use opensecrets.org because it's so like handy to have, looking at FEC reports and then also looking at, opensecrets.org, it kind of, it's like a tattletale of like that, that big like PAC money, etc. But your opponent had, as 2023 and 2024, the top industry that donated his campaign, which was $482,378, was pharmaceuticals. So it's no surprise by the fact that, he's another corporate Democrat that is bought and paid for by this big pharma, which continues to, excuse my language, but continues to fuck over, the poor and the working class. And it genuinely does because the cost continues to increase. And instead of actually addressing the actual problems, let's put a band aid across somebody's health issue, correct? Now,
Exactly.
my mom was diagnosed with stage 3 cervical cancer last year. And that was after years of medical gaslighting. They're saying, oh, you're just going through, your life changes because she's getting older. So, she's going through perimenopause and then menopause. No, it actually, and then they tried to justify saying, oh, you just have a cyst on your ovaries. And I do have permission to share this. She wants me to share it, especially with those of you that are running for Congress, because what you do doesn't only impact just your area, it impacts the entire country.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So, in regards to expanding healthcare access, in regards to, and this kind of goes in and kind of talks about something else that I wanted to go into, which is like climate change. I know that you are a survivor of a hurricane in Texas. So obviously, we'll dive in and talk about that here in just a little bit. But was there another topic that you want to kind of like jump into and address very quickly in relation to, what the conversation that we're having at this very moment is?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'll just mention one more vote that was very, very
Yes.
recent of Scott Peters. And that was in the beginning of February. It was like it's been during this continuing resolution, and he was the only California Democrat to support continuing funding for the DHS for an
Yep.
additional 2 weeks.
Yep.
He was the only California Democrat that did that. And I know you wanted to jump more into ICE later, so we could definitely save this for put a pin in this for that. But his arguments for that just don't make sense. There has
No.
been so many Democrats in Congress, including him, that proposed legislation that would fund every other part of DHS besides ICE. It would fund FEMA, it would fund so many other really important aspects. I mean, FEMA really came in and rescued the Gulf Coast communities where I grew up during the hurricanes. At the same time, I don't think that is at all an excuse to keep funding ICE. ICE is killing people, ICE is kidnapping people, and ICE, in my opinion, should not exist. So, so that was like the third big kind of red flag right out of the gate about the current representative that I feel like San Diego deserves to know, deserves to combat, and deserves to fight against.
Absolutely. 100%. Because we functioned as a country, or, allegedly functioned, but um, as a country without DHS, right? And without ICE and without it's unnecessary. And one of the things that and we'll jump into this and then we'll talk about the hurricane and such. But now that we're on the topic of ICE, let's jump right into this because there's a lot to talk about with this. And he's not obviously the only Democrat that's currently elected across the country that supported more funding for ICE and even like thinking ICE, right? Because there was a bill that came up that was actually essentially thanking ICE agents for doing their job. And it's like, hold on. The Fifth and the 14th Amendment requires and ensures access to the right to due process, right? It's a part of the United States Constitution. And then obviously seeing the attacks on birthright citizenship, obviously if you're born on American soil, you're a US citizen, point blank, regardless of the immigration status of your parents, it does not matter. If you were born in an American hospital or on an American base or American territory. I was lacking that word there for a second. I don't know if you noticed that, but it's Monday morning and my brain is all over the place. But thinking about that, how do we, as a country, obviously recognize that ICE is a deep, deep issue, and they're not going after rapists and pedophiles, convicted felons, and you're going after quote unquote illegal aliens. But in reality, no human being is illegal on stolen land. My grandmother was full blooded Native American, part of the Cherokee tribe. I feel comfortable saying that. Like she told me, she's like, this isn't white land,
Mhm.
right? This is colonized land. This is taking from those indigenous tribes, raping and murdering and pillaging, Native Americans, the first people that were here. And obviously in school, you learn Christopher Columbus is this big, hero. No. Indigenous Peoples Day is something that I celebrate very heavily. It's something that I go out to the community and just, be with organizations and just get out and kind of talk to people. So I use that day as an advocacy day because that's what's important to me. Honoring my grandmother, she passed away in 2014, but honoring that, carrying on, what she cared about is obviously fueling a lot of my, advocacy. And if I ever ran for office, it would be obviously to take the land back from the colonizers. It's something that I would hit very heavily on. But you mentioned a key thing. So under Department of Homeland Security, you have ICE, you have FEMA, you have Border Patrol, you have all of these different like aspects. I always thought it's weird to have FEMA under Department of Homeland Security. It's super awkward. It's super weird. It should be its own like entity, right? And then you have Border Patrol. Border Patrol is literally supposed to be on the border of the country, not in our communities in Minneapolis, shooting protesters. They shot and killed Alex Preddy, who was a nurse. Mr. Rogers always said we need to protect the helpers. Alex Preddy was one of those helpers. He was a veteran nurse, right? And obviously, no justice has happened. They swept this murder under the rug. Also thinking about Keith Porter, who was shot and killed on New Year's Eve, either New Year's Eve or New Year's Day in his own backyard by quote unquote a an off duty ICE agent. And he's left out of the conversation a lot. We hear a lot about Alex Preddy. We hear a lot about Renee Good. Obviously, we know why that is because they are white. Now, this is not, coming from a white perspective, this is not to diminish what those families are going through. However, there are so many more families. I'm thinking about Liam Ramos, that little child that literally tugged at my fucking heart. Whenever I saw those images, I'm getting emotional thinking about it because this child has been through hell and back. I just read an article the other day that he is currently going through psychological evaluations because the trauma that he has faced from ICE, from DHS, from this administration. So, is there reform to this, or what would you propose and what would you support? Should you be elected to Congress? What would you support in regards to quote unquote reform of ICE or just flat out abolish? I'm on the abolish side because we've been trying to reform the criminal justice system for many decades. Look what's happening. We still have the death penalty, executing proven innocent people. I want to jump into that and get your thoughts on that here in just a minute. But there's a couple different things, but I know we're kind of coming up on time shortly, but there's a couple more things that I want to hit on with you. But in regards to DHS and ICE, etc., give me your platform on that aspect.
For sure. So I agree with you. I think ICE, some people say ICE has outlived its utility. I don't think it was ever useful.
Well, it's never useful.
It was never useful. So it was founded in 2003, post
Mhm.
9/11. And to me, ICE was founded literally to look at immigrants and migrants like criminals from day one. That very civil act of struggling, of coming to the US, was not given the respect that it deserves with the foundation of ICE. ICE, from its very outset, has looked at immigrants as people who are a burden and people who are frankly criminals. That's what ICE looks at immigrants as. Like even just like the acronym, right? Like Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Why are we combining customs enforcement, which is usually criminal investigations on what is coming into the country in terms of products, and immigration, which is people who are either escaping hardship, who are wanting to make a better life for themselves, who just want a better option, who want to be successful? Why are we combining those things? That very premise is one that is bankrupt. And so I think ICE was never useful. ICE should be abolished. I would be much more in favor of an agency that is built from scratch that looks at immigration and just immigration as a civil rights issue and really addresses the concerns of migrants coming into this country as a human rights issue and really looks at people like people rather than burdens, rather than it almost seems like certain folks who are on the opposite side of this issue see people of color and migrants as vermin. And I would rather have an agency and a system that looks at people like people.
Mhm. And instead of less than, I mean, we
Mm-hmm.
see that with, in similarity, we see that with disabled people. We see that with trans
Exactly.
people. We
Yes.
see that with, differently able-bodied people. And it's so, oh my God. I mentioned earlier that we've obviously came a long way as a country, but there's so much further that we need to continue going. But I want to dive in and talk a little bit about Cancun Cruise. Oh, Let's talk about Hurricane Ike. So you were living in Texas at that time, correct? And you went through Hurricane Ike, which was in 2021. Your senator at that time, decided to go to Cancun. Um, sorry, every time I think about it, just the name Cancun Cruz because he's a failure of a senator.
Hmm.
Not just because he's a Republican, just he's a shit person. And I'm not gonna lie. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. I'm gonna say, he is another corporate shill that needs to obviously be out of the U.S. Senate, and we do not need. We, mm. Anyway, I can pop off here in a minute, but talk about your experience. Living through this hurricane. Obviously there's a lot going on in your mind, and obviously protecting your family. I'm sure that was obviously top priority, but also protecting yourself, but also protecting the people around you that you deeply care about. But being from Texas, the power grid failure as well. Because correct me if I'm wrong, but Texas is not a part of the national power grid, correct? Like it has its own its
Yes,
own like
we do.
entity, right?
Yes. Like
So,
the East has a power grid, the West has a power grid, and Texas is its own thing.
which is insane to me. I
Hmm.
mean, obviously, we see the power grid failures across the country, like the rolling blackouts, whenever people are trying to use like obviously air conditioning and then, also heating and it uses a lot of electricity, but also thinking about the spike in the electricity bills as well. I mean, yeah, it's good for the power grid because people can't afford to turn on your air, but also people are getting extremely sick, people are dying. But talk about your experience, living through this hurricane.
Yeah, absolutely. So bear with me because you mentioned two or three disasters. So Hurricane Ike, Hurricane Harvey, and the winter freeze.
Yes.
So they all happened while I was there in Texas.
Oh God.
And yeah, so Hurricane Ike actually had so Hurricane I think you were talking about Hurricane Harvey in 2021. Hurricane Ike happened in 2008. So I was just a little kid back when Hurricane Ike happened. When Hurricane Ike happened, um so my family moved out around a lot before coming to Texas because my parents were on their visas. And so when you were talking about birthright citizenship, if it were to pass, I don't know why it would, but if it were to pass in the way that Trump wants it to, I would not have been a citizen when I was
Mhm.
born too. So,
Mhm.
because they were on their visas still. But after we got to Texas, Hurricane Ike was one of the big natural disasters that affected us first. And that was when we first got a generator that for our house that we were bringing in oil for on the daily, essentially, because that disaster really lasted for a really long time. And so that one I couldn't help out as much. Again, I was just a little kid back then. But during 2021, during Hurricane Harvey, that's when I definitely got more out into my community. And actually, I think Hurricane Harvey actually did not happen in 2021. I think it was like 2017 actually. Um because I was still in high school at the time. And so during Hurricane Harvey, that that disaster was insane for the community. That was when I was really getting into engineering. So when I saw my teachers' houses were flooded, me and my friends, we would go to our teachers' houses. We would help punch down the sheetrock so that they could help rebuild
Mhm.
the houses. So we would go to our teachers' houses and help do that. We would go to our high school gym. Our high school gym had been turned into a makeshift shelter, and we would help deliver whatever we had in our houses, which wasn't much, but we would stock up usually on toilet paper, bananas, peanut butter, just like things that we could rely on, sustain ourselves on, knowing that the hurricane is coming. And any extras that we would have, especially water bottles and toilet paper, we would bring to the shelter at our high school. And so. So that was when I first really got involved in the community. And honestly, that was when I really wanted to become an engineer because I thought there were so many ways that we could like re-engineer these systems. We could weatherize even like our power grid, which happened in during the winter freeze of 2020, 2021. And at the same time, the directly impacted folks were getting the most help by people on the ground, by that grassroots community work on the ground. And so that is where I really found my route in terms of how I could be useful to the community at the time. And from that, I got more involved in climate justice work. It wasn't really my focus area, but since then I've been involved in more disruptive actions with Fridays for Future USA and other organizations as well. And yeah, and you're so right. You mentioned that the Texas power grid is separate from the eastern and western ones. ERCOT has its own power grid. It's not, and because it's not part of any of these two major power grids, there has been a lot of upgrades to these two major ones that have not happened to ERCOT. And they are kind of immune from federal regulation. The power grid is not weatherized, so that winter freeze when it froze over the grid, it was not prepared for that. And I was doing remote school at San Diego, but I was tuning in from Texas during that time. So I had to tell my teachers and professors a week later that the reason I was absent from their classes was because I literally had no power. And we were just all curled up in front of like a little fire at our house during that time because it was freezing. We had no power and we couldn't go anywhere. I mean, uh, it's not often that it snows in Texas, especially where I am, so the roads were not salted for a while. So it was just a terrible, terrible situation. And yeah, and we definitely need representatives that are going to advocate for more jobs in the sustainability sector and who are going to make it so that sustainable development is the way we go forward. And the representation in San Diego does not advocate for progressive legislation like the Green New Deal, progressive jobs creating legislation like the Green New Deal. And that is something I advocate for. I know that there's such an importance of training skilled workers and technicians and all of these amazing folks and retraining folks who work, for example, on oil rigs to help work on that sustainable development transition, that green transition. And I believe that the only way we can do that is through resourcing such a transition through progressive policies like the Green New Deal and through combating fossil fuel money in our the same system and really making that just transition uh the bottom line in terms of how we move forward. And yeah, as someone who was affected by the hurricanes, but more importantly, really saw people's entire lives fall apart. They had built their houses in certain communities. Um, we were affected by a little bit by flooding and a lot of wind damage, but in terms of our house, the foundation remained. A lot of community members were not that lucky. Most community members whose walls I helped break down so that um, people could come back and rebuild. That was your only house, and it was completely ruined. A foot of sheetrock from the bottom was cut across the house because it was waterlogged, and people. So that was my community. In neighboring communities, people had to like be they had to be voted out of their houses. And a really good family friend, they lost their entire house. They could not even go back to the community where they were initially staying at. And even things like FEMA coverage only go so far. So I think that preventing these calamities is definitely the way forward, and we do that by putting federal dollars where we think it's really important, and where we know it's important because people lose their homes, people lose their lives from inaction.
You said a key thing, and it's inaction because it's not just inaction on local leaders, but it's also federal leaders. It's all of it combined, right? I want to jump back in really quick and talk about an article that came out earlier this morning from the San Diego Union Tribune. And the headline is More ICE detainees are being taken to San Diego County Hospital, data show. And facilities in National City, Chula Vista, and Hillcrest say they treat detainees but don't allow ICE to leave patients. Local hospitals are treating significantly more U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement detainees under the Trump administration. Federal data shows at least 59 ICE detainees received care at San Diego County hospitals from January to mid-October last year, up from 29 during the entire prior year, according to ICE agency data obtained by the Deportation Data Project via public record request and analyzed by the San Diego Union Tribune. Nationwide, hospital ICE detentions rose from about 1,300 in 2024 to 1,900 from January to mid October 2025, the data shows. ICE has since stopped releasing data detailing detentions in hospitals because, God forbid, it would make it look even fucking worse. Um, but we've also seen people dying in these detention centers. There was a couple that they ruled as quote unquote suicide. There was a couple that they ruled as, oh, they were having these issues because they're not receiving this adequate health care within these ICE detention facilities and blocking Congress members, which they have a constitutional right to do these drop-ins, and they don't have to be announced. It's like legally required, by Congress that they go and investigate like these facilities and look at these facilities. So we've talked a lot about ICE, but there's a lot going on here. And, as in regards to like oversight, would you support obviously more federal oversight of these facilities? And what would that look like to you? Because obviously everything just needs to be completely reworked. And I guess this is a part of that quote unquote reform aspect, until we can officially abolish ICE, we get a majority of people who actually want to abolish ICE and actually do that work. But there are things that we can do leading up to that point. And this is one of them is that federal oversight. I feel like there needs to be like an actual committee or something, because obviously the committee that's currently in Congress, it it's a whole mess, right? But there needs to be a separate like entity and just obviously focusing on the observation of these facilities. So, what do you support in regards to your platform of the federal oversight of these ICE detention facilities?
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely think there should be federal oversight in general of these facilities, again, until we can get rid of them altogether. I also really believe that when we say, oh, we're bringing more dollars into DHS, if you're gonna bring more dollars into DHS, might as well condition it to where those dollars go towards improving the quality of life in these facilities.
Because they're still human beings. They're
Exactly.
living human, breathing human beings that are in these facilities. They still deserve the same access to everything. The land of the free, right?
Exactly.
And Republicans for some reason think that free means we give out handouts, we do that. This is actually helping the quality of life, and the life expectancy has significantly dropped because of that lack of healthcare, the lack of food, the lack of housing, the lack of humanity from
Hmm.
Congress, right? Not just Congress, because like you said, it also goes down to the state government, etc. But you bring up a key thing, and it's deeply important to talk about because thinking about canvassing your neighborhoods, right? So, have you gone out canvassing and talked with like your constituents and such? I'm sure you have. I
We
think
do every night on the
yes,
weekdays, every morning on the weekends.
yeah. So, what are you hearing from the people in your district? Because or the people in your district, because obviously these are the same people that have elected your opponent, right, for many many years, over a decade, right? Um, but in regards to what you're hearing from your constituent or your potential constituents, what are the top issues that you are hearing the most?
Mhm. So, affordability is definitely one of the biggest issues in San Diego. I think across the nation,
Yeah.
but in San Diego as well. Affordability and ICE raids because ICE is such a the Border Patrol and ICE has always been a very visible part of San Diego because
Mhm.
we are a border city. It's just so much worse now. And so getting rid of ICE has definitely been a huge, huge concern for so many constituents, especially Democratic constituents who may have voted for Scott in the past. Additionally, yes, affordability. And affordability, for me, affordability is very much a multi-pronged issue that requires a multi-step approach, especially on the federal level. And I believe that our current representation and corporate Dem representation fails on so many aspects of this. I believe to get affordability really under check, people should not have to worry about student loans. That includes making public colleges free to start out. It includes it includes getting student loan relief for people who have already paid that full amount and have somehow double of what they initially owed still owed to the government for their loans. There are so many people who took out $90,000 in loans, paid that 90,000, but suddenly they have like 200K left in student
Mhm.
loans. So getting people that relief is super, super important to me. Then looking at healthcare. Healthcare is overpriced, and we talked about this already, but passing a single payer Medicare for all system, looking at even looking at pricing in general, passing price gouging bans federally on the federal level, passing corporate landlord bans on the federal level to make basics more affordable, to make housing more affordable. These are all ways that we can get that affordability crisis under check. And in San Diego, particularly, San Diego G&E, SDG&E, which is our main gas and electric company, is one of the most expensive gas and electric companies nationwide.
Oof.
So exactly. So when
Oof.
people hear that Sempra Energy, which is the owner of SDG&E, is a big backer of the current
Oh.
representative, right?
Oh.
Right. They get pissed off. They see their gas and electric bills going through the roof and no action against preventing that. And they want change that starts with progressive legislation that will ban price gouging in times of crisis, which now is as good a time as any to incorporate that kind of a ban. So affordability has definitely been the biggest issue. People look at gas prices and I'm like, well, okay, that's Iran right there for you. And us being in Iran, we should not be there. Um, we are fighting a war for another genocidal nation, Israel, and we should not be there. But that is why your gas prices are increasing. But even before that, affordability has been an issue for so many years at this point, and we really talk to them about progressive legislation. If we're reaching out to more independent voters or even conservative leaning voters, we talk about affordability and the policies without any buzzwords, without like, oh, progressive, this is a democratic socialist ideal. Although we I do consider myself a democratic socialist, and um but we talk to them about, oh, you don't like what SDG&E is doing? There's ways to regulate that on the federal level. There's
Mhm.
ways to really crack down on them price gouging you, on them pricing you out of the very community you grew up in and you helped push forward. And so that is the biggest issue at the door. On top of that, many community members are really feeling the impacts of ICE raids. Um, just down the street, in a neighborhood that's slightly outside of my district, there was an ICE raid that happened a few months ago at Buena and and so many people turned out. definitely traumatized so many folks who are working at Bueno Forchetta, which is a restaurant here, um, because ICE raided that restaurant and was trying to take their workers, and the restaurant really tried protecting their workers. And so has directly impacted the community in the far-flung reaches of our community in Valley Center. A lot of that land is farmland that is tended to by migrant workers that come up 2, 3, 4 hours every day on buses that run only every 2 hours to work those fields. And
Mhm.
so even that area, which is much more conservative, is feeling the impacts of this cruelty and the fear that comes with these raids and really wants to see better for people they consider a part of their community. When it's happening in front of you, it's so hard to
Mhm.
abstract it away as an issue that a rhetorical issue, which is what Trump makes it. It is so hard to do that when you see your own family members, your own community members who have helped your business, who have helped you move forward and reach higher levels of economic success get kidnapped, get killed. And even conservative voters resonate with that. They don't want to see that happening to their community. And so,
No, and we're seeing a lot of those communities rise up, and there's some of those communities are even the most loudest in
exactly.
opposition to this because it's like, in these rural areas, they're all they have. And you take one of them that, or, you kidnap one of them because let's be real,
Hmm.
because without the right to due process, it's literally a federal sanctioned kidnapping. But it, there's a lot that goes into that. And there's a lot, yeah. And I'm seeing a lot of rise up from those rural communities and even states that I wouldn't even imagine. Like I saw some pushback from like a Missouri town,
Hmm.
right? And they took one of their immigrant neighbors, and that community is pissed, right? Obviously, and this is also one of the same communities that literally flipped practically an entire city council because they wanted to build a billion or a multi-billion-dollar data center, these AI data centers, which contributes into, obviously the rising cost of electric bills, also the water supply, it contributes to climate change, and then obviously like the unregulated aspect of AI too, and how deeply alarming it is. Also seeing, like Grok, Elon Musk and these oligarchs and these tech bros, and the censorship on Meta platforms obviously is a huge thing as well. But I know we're coming up on time here, but there's one last thing that I wanted to address. Your opponent received a $2,500 donation from the Chickasaw Nation based in Oklahoma, which obviously is a Native American tribal. But I find it ironic. I find it wild. There's a lot of other kind of questionable donations, per the FEC reports. A lot, like I said, a lot of it is PAC money. A lot of it is the big money influence. I saw there was like a T-Mobile donation, which is wild.
Hmm.
Um, Independent Community Bankers of America, Next Era Energy. I think you were talking about that just a second ago, right?
Hmm.
Next Era Energy Incorporated Political Action Committee received $1,000 donation on December 18th. Or yeah, and year to date is 3,000 from this energy company. So yeah, obviously there's a lot of questionable things here. So continue addressing that with your community because I think it's going to get you across the finish line because those are things that you can really hit hard on. Obviously your experience as an organizer in housing, climate, and I think you just bring this energy that is so incredibly inspiring to see younger people kind of like rise up and like, hey, you know what? We're done with these oligarchs. We're done with the patriarchy. We're done, you know, bending over backwards for these corporations and for these billionaires continue rigging our elections, continue, doing whatever the hell it is that they do on a daily basis. I mean, the vice president was negotiating a war while Donald Trump was at a UFC event. Also, Guy Fieri was also there, and also Andrew Tate, who's currently being investigated for sex trafficking, was also there. We have a picture And there's a video, and it's so deeply disturbing. It's like a big pedophile ring at a UFC event.
Exactly.
Um, maybe we should put them all in. Never mind. Anyway, um, that's a whole nother conversation. But is there anything else that you wanted to kind of share with people? What is it like running for office? And kind of, but we'll end here. Again, thank you for coming on the podcast. You've been a very big insight, and you've actually kind of helped me create some questions that I'm going to ask some of the other candidates just based off of this, because the answers that you've provided, I think it shows that, we the people have the power. Congress has the power of the purse. We need to utilize that. These billionaires need to stop having influence in our elections and having influence in, these candidacies and also our elected officials, right? Um, but just thinking about that, what has been your experience running for Congress, like as of right now? Obviously, when's your primary?
June 2nd.
Okay.
Yes. Primary is June 2nd. So if you live in the San Diego region, I urge you to come out and vote for the progressive option in this race.
Yes. Yes.
And but it has been very, very, very encouraging, and it has been really uplifting. We know we're up against a lot of big money. We know, I mean, even if we take up, even if we don't look at corporate funding, which we absolutely should, our current
Mhm.
representative himself is a centimillionaire. And so his net worth is tens of millions, I believe, reaching over $100 million, like around $135 million. And so he has really benefited from the system, which a majority of people have not benefited in the same way from this hyper capitalist system. So for me, it has been a very, very encouraging campaign that has brought together a lot of people. We just had a meet and greet where people from all walks of life were there, whether they're a community organizer or someone who is just really disgruntled by the ICE raids, or a PTA mom, or a synthetic biologist. And so we've really been bringing both people who vote regularly, people who don't vote regularly together, who are just really upset with what's happening in their communities right now. And even though we have an uphill battle ahead of us, it is not uphill with the lived experience, with the people power that this movement is generating. It is just another fight that we have to win. We can't afford to lose, because the future of our nation frankly depends on our success, and depends on the success of not one person, not one election, but the success of the people getting together and fighting for the change that they deserve and the rights that they are not being granted by their current representation and their current government. And that is why we are fighting. We are fighting because we want to bring in these voices, not just as a representative, but amplifying these voices as their in their own right, instead of amplifying the voices of corporations and acting like they are people. Those are not people. Those are entities that are built on the backs of the working class, of the working people. And it is bringing those very voices into the conversation why I first joined this fight, and why we continue to fight, and why we're very encouraged by the people that we're bringing in to the movement, both longtime activists and freshly activated. So we are very excited about this campaign, and we are very excited by this campaign. We're Our entire team is super young, super excited, super rejuvenated, and we're bringing people together across the state. We have been collaborating with other progressive candidates, up ballot, down ballot. We have collaborated with candidates like Oliver Ma, who's running for lieutenant governor. We are collaborating with candidates across the country through coalitions that have been built through citizens impeachment, reasoned reality. There has been so much power that has been generated, and energy and community, intersectional community that has been generated, and I can't see anything but a wave of hope in front of me. And I am so, so excited by that. And I believe the people behind me are too.
Citizens impeachment is how I've learned about a lot of candidates. They've sent a lot of people our way.
Hmm.
and very, very progressive group of people. They're very exciting, to be around. Very, because it does show like we, the people, have the power.
Absolutely.
So, with that being said, how can people contribute to your campaign? Obviously, you have the opportunity to obviously collaborate with us anytime that you have anything amplified. We have a lot of people that are really paying attention to the elections across the country, especially with this election series. This comes very, or this candidate series that I'm doing right now. It has a lot of momentum behind it because candidates are being recommended to us like left and right. People are reaching out. It is insane. Our DMs are off the rockers, but it shows that people are fed up. It shows that the current system is not working. And practically never has, but enough is enough, right? But how can people continue to uplift your campaign, support the work that you are doing, and obviously we'll add your donation link into the bio or into the description of this episode. This episode will go across all the platforms, and I'm really excited to continue collaborating with you. And I'm inspired by your energy, and I'm inspired by the campaign that you're running because it's the very Zoran energy that got Zoran Dani elected as New York City mayor,
Absolutely.
which was deeply inspiring.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
don't think I've ever aligned with a candidate more than I have with Zoran. That is literally like a legend to me. I know about Zoran even whenever he was an assembly member because
Hmm.
he shined, and he genuinely cares about the city. Um,
Hmm.
just had to add that shameless plug in there. You bring that same energy. Um, I'm talking with somebody who actually worked on this campaign here pretty soon, so I'm excited to
Oh
get
my
more of the insight in that. But how can people continue to uplift the work that you were doing and contribute to your campaign and follow you on social media too?
Absolutely. First, that is high praise. Love getting compared to that man. Um, but yeah, so y'all, anyone can go to sparkymitra.com. That has the donation link on there. Otherwise, at Sparky Mitra, if you just search up Act Blue Sparky Mitra, you can also find the donation link there. But the easiest way to honestly get in contact with my team to get more information on my platform and to donate is to just go to sparkymitra.com and donate there. And yeah, I'm super, super excited to bring in more people into the movement just at large. Activating people is so energizing, and I feel like some of us sometimes the people who've been at this for 30 years need a break. And so having that new energy and making sure people aren't burnt out is a big part of building this community as well. So and I think Zoran was amazing at that, really activating the entire city because of his platform, because the issues where it really matters, he's shown. And he has already been bringing in seismic change into the city. Like we always look at the issues that he's been really good about already addressing, whether it's childcare, whether it's filling potholes and infrastructure improvements. But I also look at my Columbia uh, compadres who were expelled or suspended. And even though he didn't have a direct hand on them getting reinstated, I believe this is one of the first times where such a mass expulsion has actually been revoked. And most students, if not all of them, have either been given their diplomas or been reinstated to going back to school after a judge's decision under this new mayorship. And so there's definitely this progressive energy that is not just infectious across the masses, it's infectious across change and bringing about change. And I believe that the entire country is long due for similar action.
Yep, exactly. All right. Well, that's a wrap.
Thank
Again,
you
thank
so
you so
much.
much for coming on the podcast and bringing in this infectious energy. And anybody out there, please follow Sparky on social media, contribute to the campaign. And, I look forward to seeing you continue to go as a candidate and hopefully as the next Congress person out of California, the progressive voices. I am so inspired. I think it's so deeply energizing. And yes, thank you so much for, again, coming on the podcast, but also for running, not for yourself. I mean, obviously, it comes with a paycheck, obviously, but I know that it's way more than that
Mhm.
because it's actually making that real change that's going to sustain the poor and the working classes, and eradicate the top 1% and make them pay, obviously, their fair share. There's a lot more into that. But again, thank you so much. I appreciate you. Of
Thank you.
course, thank you.